Good morning, everyone. This is Jane, and this is another session of 28 Days of Technology Careers. We've heard a lot about data scientists, data architect, data engineering, product managers. Well, what about security? So today we have two special speakers to talk to us a little bit more about what some of the security aspect of what we learned with data and products. So having that said, I will just start with Prima.
Hey everyone, I'm Prima. I'm a security engineer at Pinterest. I've been doing security for about 7 years now. I got my university degree in cyber forensics and information security management from Australia, from Perth in Australia, in fact. And that's where I started my career as well. So I can give you a little bit of an overview of what that looked like for me and how changing moving to Silicon Valley changed things and so on and so forth. I started out in this place called Perth that's literally halfway, the other side of the earth from here, in back in Australia. And I started working in oil and gas industry. So I can give you an overview of what that looks like and then how that contrasts to working here. Um, at that place, we had approximately two and a half full-time people to do security full-time technically, and we had maybe three people to do governance, compliance, and risk. Considering we were a very small team, and I was the most junior, I was fresh out of university at that point. A lot of the work that I did was mostly, getting instructions from my manager and trying to follow them around and trying to figure out what's that they are doing and starting out to, help basically. Um, I, so the role was a lot more IT focused, and I didn't code at all. Which, if I even mention it to somebody here in the valley, they'd be extremely surprised. Having said that, my title was never of an engineer, anyways. So I was considered an IT engineer, which were IT security operations coordinator. That's what my official title was, and it was more of an analyst role, I'd say. It, I worked a lot with firewalls. I worked a lot with systems. I worked a lot with switches and routers and networking gear. But any technology that we used for our day-to-day, work was all standard software that we could buy from such and such vendors, and our job was to basically run it properly and to run it to its full capacity. A lot of my work was very detection and response focused, although we didn't call it that back then. All security, all blue teaming that I'd ever known at that point was detection and response. There were no other branches of security like product security or application security as we know it in the valley. So there was a little bit of red teaming. There was a little bit of penetration testing, and you'd hire external testers from time to time. But that wasn't, very common at all. Only some companies would do that. Financial industry, of course, like banking, was a lot more rigorous about it. But any other industry in Australia was probably not focused on anything else other than protecting the basics of threat detection and response in an infrastructure. So that was that. And then I moved to San Francisco about 4 years ago. I started working at Pandora, which is the popular online internet radio company. A lot of my role there was also kind of a focus on IT. The security engineering team that I was a part of was very much a part of this org called TechOps. And a lot of the work that I started doing was vulnerability and patch management and deploying that through our organization, scaling that. A lot of the focus there as well initially was on solutions that we could buy till somebody came along who could start building their own thing. So then I started following them along a little bit, and I started to learn to code, and I started to make smaller changes and amendments and started writing smaller scripts. This was still the time when a lot of our infrastructures ran on bare metal. We would have our infrastructures be running at data centers. So both the jobs that I had at that point were both, they had nothing to do with AWS. Whereas the rest of the industry was quickly changing. At that point, a majority of the industry, a majority of the startups, the more prominent startups, had started out on AWS. They wanted very little data center space. They wanted to do as much as possible on AWS. And so a lot of the infrastructure security's focus was shifting from bare metal data center security to security in AWS. And, again, I knew nothing about it at that point. I started learning that very slowly, but the truth is that you don't necessarily get exposed to it as much unless you actually start getting your hands dirty and start working in an environment that's fully AWS focused. So, keeping that in mind, I decided to take up my next role at a place that was very AWS focused, or at least had a heavier AWS focus and a 30% or less of data center presence. Because I also wanted to deliver, I also wanted to leave an impact. I did not want to, be completely in a new territory. But at the same time, I also wanted to try out these new technologies, and I wanted an environment that enabled learning of that environment for me, where there was enough support. So then I found this great team who had a lot of experience running AWS with a lot of senior engineers who I could work with. And I was a mid-senior engineer at that point myself. I just did not specialize in AWS skills. At that point, I'd also ramped up my coding skills. So I volunteered in my team to take on all of the building projects, all of the scripting projects, and I started coding full on in Python. And it was the perfect environment for me because I believe that there was enough room for me to make errors, and there was enough support to see me through those frustrations. Yeah, and then from there, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been extremely AWS focused, extremely scripting focused, and now my role is that of a builder, I'd say. Where I am hardly using. I'm not. I've gone from being a user of security technologies, I'd say, to being a builder of security technologies, and so you can see how that has changed over less than a decade of time. For me personally, eventually, I do believe that getting to know a lot more of Kubernetes and Docker security is where my next focus is going to be. I don't know a lot about it at this point, but hopefully very soon I get my hands dirty in that, and I get to keep moving with the moving focus of technologies. With moving focus of where do we run our code, basically. Wherever we run our code is where I want to secure that. That's how my career has gone over the last about 7 years. And I'm open to any questions if you all might have.
So what are some of the tools you're using right now for your job?
So a lot of the tools that I'm using right now are, as I mentioned earlier, AWS focused. So for detection and response side of things, we use Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. One of my key projects is building a log pipeline for detection and collection of logs and analysis of logs so that we can look for threats in our infrastructure. And to build that, I'm primarily using AWS's Lambda functions. I'm writing my scripts in the Lambda functions. Those functions are then scheduled in another AWS service called CloudWatch. That triggers the function to be run every 5 minutes. and all of the logs are then collected in an S3, which is another AWS service, and AWS storage service. In an S3 bucket, all of our logs are collected, and then they are set to our Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana cluster. So a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what I do is very serverless focused, serverless architecture focused. And in order to make all of our code, a lot of our infrastructure settings available to the rest of the team, and to enable reviewing of those settings, we try and go for this mindset called infrastructure as code. So for that, we use this tool called Terraform, where we basically write out the scope of and the specs of all of our infrastructure that we're building in a code format, and basically make any changes to that in order to change our infrastructure. We don't necessarily use a lot of the AWS's user console to make changes, because that has very limited visibility. Not everybody can keep logging onto it and keep reviewing these things. It's a lot of kind of wasted effort as well. So with infrastructure as code, we have a lot more version control, like how we have for the rest of the application code. And it gives us a lot more control and all of that. So that's where a lot of my work is at the moment.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we also use this tool called Elastol, which is an open source tool for alerting purposes, because all of the threats that we build alerts for, we need those to be delivered either in an email or Slack, or in form of a Jira ticket. And Elastol lets us configure that. So that's basically all those configurations are using YAML files.
Okay, so pardon my, lack of security expertise, but it sounds like you do, rely on some automation, but at the same time, you still have a lot of human checking, human validation, validity entails in your day-to-day job. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. So for anything that we detect as a threat in our infrastructure, we have to, go and we have to analyze it. We have to see what is that malicious actor, in what capacity is it trying to run. So for that, we have, tools like Carbon Black, for example. That's a very popular vendor in the security space. And basically that lets us see if there's a malicious file on an user's computer, what are the behaviors of the file? What is it trying to do? Is it trying to spawn various processes? Is it self-destructing? Is it trying to spawn a sub-process and then destructing itself? And is it trying to delete something? Is it trying to write something to the file system? We basically go through all of that data in order to determine what's the scope of this threat actor, how malicious is it, how can it be cleaned, and so on and so forth.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Prima, we see two questions coming in chat. So the first question is from Anna. She's asking, can you talk about security for Docker and Kubernetes? Is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Yeah, so there you go. You're probably familiar with that term. And then what kind of problems need your attention with these tools?
So, hey, Anna, please pardon my ignorance here, but security for Docker and Kubernetes is not an area that I've touched yet a lot. I do plan on, venturing down that path as soon as I get an opportunity. But so far, I haven't really played around with any of those tools at all. That's where my focus is next. So, as soon as something comes up, I'm going to leap onto it, but I don't necessarily have a lot of information on it just yet. What I do know is that the way Docker runs is basically on the host computer. It basically ties itself to a process, and then it runs on top of that. There are a lot of issues around updating, keeping your Dockers up to date, and a lot of vulnerable Dockers are left out there that are facing the internet. So that can be a big challenge. Kubernetes, from what I know, is an orchestration tool that lets you manage your Dockers, that lets you, keep them up to date and stuff like that. So I'm assuming that a lot of the security challenges that we'd have with Dockers would be similar to what we'd have with something like Ansible or Puppet. Basically, if anybody is able to take control of your Kubernetes tool, they'll be able to control all of your Docker services, and they'll be able to run malicious tools and malicious campaigns at scale. So if your Docker, if your Kubernetes gets compromised, that could potentially basically be game over. Again, that's my speculation and that's my assumption. I'll know more once I use the tool myself.
Okay, great. There is another question, I believe, from Michelle. She asks, do you have any advice on obtaining any security-focused certifications? Have you seen that your employers value certification or education focused in security?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do have some advice on obtaining security-focused certifications. I'd say early in your career, definitely do that. It's not about whether or not your employer values it. It's about how much you get to learn from preparing towards those certifications. So definitely, and I've had great employers who've encouraged me to go for these certifications. My first certificate that I remember very clearly was the Security Plus by CompTIA. My next certificate that I went for was the basic CCNA, because at the time, network security was where our team's focus was, and I didn't know a lot about networking, that I had to learn and quickly catch up, and so on and so forth. So I got great support from my employer. They paid for it, and I did all of the training and education on my own, because I personally believe that for myself, think that it's the most effective if I can, go through a text or a big book and make my own notes and do my own research wherever I have questions, and I can go at my own pace. For some people, structured training works better because that helps them stay focused. When there's a trainer giving you the lecture or giving you the information, it helps some people. Some people are they retain information a lot better in an audible oratory way, whereas other people like me retain information a lot better when we see it. So that depends on what your kind of learning style is what you should go for. After that, very recently, I also went for CISSP. Even though no company in the Bay Area values it as much, they don't consider that having or not having CISSP as a big thing. But if you decide to go for traditional industries like government or oil and gas or mining or even banking and finance, they place a lot of value on CISSP and or more senior certificates. You can't even be certified for CISSP unless you can prove 5 years of experience in the industry. So even if you give your exam when you can give your exam when you don't have that experience, and you can then, when you meet that level of experience, you can tell them that I've passed my exam in such and such year and I've completed my experience requirements as well, and they'll certify you with a full CISSP certification. But yeah, those are my 2 cents on it. Definitely go for certificates for your own information and for your own education. And if you intend to not work in the Silicon Valley, it can be very helpful.
Since you mentioned Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
There's a lot of great conferences, etc. So have you been going to any, say, security related conference that you would recommend for everybody, or any that's coming up that you're
Oh,
going
yeah, absolutely. Sure. So a lot of the conferences and a lot of the talks that I attend tend to be the more local ones. Because what happens is a lot of the speakers who speak at Black Hat or DEF CON, which are the two most popular security conferences, a lot of the speakers who intend to speak at Black Hat or DEF CON tend to run a local session with a smaller group. They give the same talk a lot of the times in a smaller setting in the Bay Area. So I try and seek out those. OWASP is a great organization that organizes meetups every month. There's usually one in the South Bay and one in San Francisco, and I try to go for the ones in San Francisco. Other than that, there are kind of scattered events around, focused around detection and response, the local events that local meetups that I tend to go to. Women in Security and Privacy is a great organization in the Bay Area that organizes events every few months, and I try and make a point to go to those events for sure. I've also spoken at one of the detection and response focused events for women in security and privacy. This particular event was hosted at Dropbox last year. So I definitely recommend both of those organizations meetups. Other than that, there's something called DFIR, the Bay Area DFIR meetup. From time to time, I try and go to that. I go to B-Sides San Francisco every year, definitely, because there are a lot of very interesting technology-focused talks there. Um, I went to DEF CON in 2015, but ever since then, I haven't really been. I do intend to go later this year. There's also something called Cactus Con that happens in Arizona, which is very interesting. A smaller group, more focused on detection and response again, that if you're interested, you should definitely check out. Other than that, I think those are all that I can think of on top of my mind right now.
Okay, those are great information. Shreya, is that how you say your name? Shared another comment. She said there's another security and women-focused conference called Women in Cybersecurity. Their annual conference was last week in Pittsburgh. It's in Denver next year, March 14th to 16th. It's a great community to join. So, hey, thank you so much for sharing that too.
Oh, and I actually forgot to mention Anita Borg. I forgot to mention Grace Hopper. So Grace Hopper's security track tends to be really good as well. And I spoke at Grace Hopper 2 years ago. And when I spoke there, I also attended a whole bunch of security focused, a lot of the talks in the security track. And those tend to be great as well. So if you're going to Grace Hopper this year, definitely check out the security track at Grace Hopper.
Great. So if anyone else have any more questions for you, they can reach you through your social media channels.
100%. They can reach out to me. They can either email me directly at pvirani@pinterest.com, or you can tweet to me. My Twitter handle is secnerdet, like nerd, but like a woman. So, so you can reach out to me on secnerdet. I'm usually pretty active on Twitter, and feel free to DM me or send out a tweet and say hi. I'd love to talk to you.
Great. Oh, one more question. What is your advice to someone who wants to get into governance, risk, and compliance as an entry-level position in InfoSec?
Sure. So I'd say seek out internships, internship opportunities if possible. Network a lot, because I know that a lot of the governance, risk, and compliance focus teams are looking for people to help them out, but they don't necessarily have an avenue where they tend to go and look for those people other than in meetups and in networking events. So I would place a very high emphasis on going out to networking events, seeking out people who work in the industry already, and try and see if there is space for a junior governance, risk, and compliance person on their team.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm going to quickly hand it over to Devika.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Prima. It was really good. And to add to what a few people were asking about, for governance, risk, and compliance, I do think that networking is very important, especially in industries that kind of prioritize it. For example, I work at Bloomberg, which is in the financial side of things, even though it's a financial tech company. And we're always looking for people to fill that role. And like Prima said, there isn't really a direct channel. So feel free to reach out to me outside of this, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Today, I'd like to talk about product security and how I got into it, and what I do, and if you're interested, how you can also get into it. This picture on this slide is one of my favorite pictures because, you know, this is a paraphrasing of something that Eleanor Roosevelt said, well-behaved woman rarely makes history, but it's kind of like a cheeky take on that for security, because a well-behaved application rarely makes history. That literally is coming from the fact that it's kind of like an answer to what is a secure application, right? How do you define a secure application? And the way I like to define it is an application that does only what it's supposed to, and doesn't do anything that it's not supposed to. And by virtue of that, it's probably not going to make history, because good security rarely gets press. And it's only when breaches happen that, you know, everyone gets to hear about it. I'll give you a little bit of background on how I ended up here. So I did my undergrad in computer science and engineering, and then I took a couple of electives in my final year of undergrad in Introduction to Cryptography and Introduction to Information Security that kind of kickstarted my interest in the field. And then I applied to a few schools to do my master's in information security, and I ended up going to Pittsburgh, to Carnegie Mellon, and I got my degree from there in 2012. In Master's in Information Security. Once I graduated, I actually had the option to pursue either, I had offers in information security related roles as well as file systems, because my internship and other background was also in file systems and operating systems. But I think at that point, I was weighing, should I go towards security or systems? And at that point, security was less interesting or like less mainstream than it is now. I was like, this looks interesting, so I would give it a try, and I joined Adobe. I joined Adobe actually as a Flash runtime security engineer. So my first ever job was working on the plugin for the Flash player in the Mozilla the Firefox browser, and we were actually creating a sandbox for the Flash plugin to bring down the number of security vulnerabilities that Flash was inadvertently exposing people to be exploited through. After about a year of that, Adobe was slowly going into the mode of having Flash on maintenance rather than coming up with a lot of new features. I think some of you may know that Flash is supposed to be kind of retired by end of next year. So that was kind of like the beginning stages of going towards that path. And at that point, I was thinking, okay, I've done security engineering. I find it interesting. I want to remain in the field. But if the product I'm working on is kind of going into a maintenance mode, then maybe it would not be the most fun, maybe to work on like new or like different things for me. So I wanted to see what else I could do. And I ended up moving to this other team within Adobe called the Asset team, which was like the central security in-house experts team. And this team worked or even works now with various teams within Adobe, kind of providing in-house consultation, helping create roadmaps for the products, and basically embedding themselves in kind of the engineering teams to give them good security solutions and best practices, etc. etc. And I really enjoyed that role. I also had I worked at Adobe for about 4.5 years, with the first year being a security engineer, and then the rest of my time being a security researcher doing security for products, ranging from like completely desktop-based, like Lightroom, to on-premise complex systems like Adobe Connect, which is a conferencing application, as well as products that were moving to Adobe Creative Cloud. So I got a pretty good taste of like different kinds of security, different kinds of application security that I was looking at. I had a brief stint in incident response and malware analysis while I was at Adobe for almost a year. And while I really enjoyed that, it really made me flex my muscles on the malware analysis side. I hadn't looked at assembly since I had graduated, so it was kind of rusty. It was fun to go back and look at assembly, but I realized that incident response required a slightly different mindset. Like, you have to be available to work on something as soon as someone has reported an external vulnerability, and that was thrilling. You have to come up with what the patch is and figure out if the proof of concept is actually an issue, and then work with engineers to fix it, etc. So it was a slightly different mindset than the proactive security that I had been doing up until that point. So it was pretty good to get a taste of that. And then, of course, I went back to doing my role. I had been filling in for like someone who had left, and we hadn't hired someone at that point. So that ended up being about 8 months of me getting a taste of something in reactive security. And then I went back to doing proactive defensive security. And at some point, about after 4.5 years, I was like, I want to kind of stretch my wings a bit. I wanted to see if I could get more responsibility. I had been working on this team doing mostly what would be termed as security within the software development lifecycle, which was actually pretty established at Adobe even by the time I had joined as a fresh out of school junior security researcher. So I moved to the role I have now. Right now I'm a security architect at Bloomberg, and I have additional responsibilities than my previous roles. I'm getting to do more in this role. I mostly do threat modeling and pen testing, and I'll go into that a little bit. And I work on what we call the security testing team within the product security team at Bloomberg, and that's again part of the Chief Information Security Office at Bloomberg. In my role, I mostly talk to engineers and developers at Bloomberg when they're creating new features or coming up with a new product. I help them to securely design, implement, and deploy products. So the way our team works is engineers reach out to us when they're creating a new product, a new feature. Then we discuss with them what they're trying to build out, what workflows and use cases they're looking at. Then we talk about what kind of security assumptions we're making, and if we have sufficient security controls to ensure those assumptions can stay true. Then the engineers implement features and the security controls that we have discussed. And then our team, or in this case me, I go back and look at the implementation, which means after the design review, I also do the code and pen testing. I do the code review and I also do pen testing. Just a simple example could be like coming up with a new comment section feature for a website. And a specific use case would be that all users can read comments, only logged in users can post comments, and only logged in admin users can delete comments. So if you have like a workflow or like a use case where you want this to be true, then we would discuss what kind of access control is going on over here, like what kind of authentication and authorization frameworks are being used, and make sure that nobody gets more access or privilege than they are supposed to. So that's typically what my day-to-day looks like. After the feature is implemented, I would also go and do pen testing to see that if I log in as a user, is there any way to get privileges of an admin, like playing around in the website? So if I, as a regular user, can I delete a comment even if I don't have that access level? Or can I get that access level to delete that comment? That's a quick overview of the kind of approach that we have to design and code review as well as pen testing. A lot of my day-to-day activities include like architecture review of an upcoming product, strengthening the security controls, reviewing code, pen testing, but we also do a lot of training developers in security, and also providing security solutions and best practices for like specific one-off scenarios. So in the diagram that I have up here, that's mostly activities that would map to a traditional SDLC lifecycle, but this is the security within the software development lifecycle that map to a regular SDLC. My team, that is a product security team, we work on the two blocks that you can see: design review and implementation review and pen testing. The other one, secure deployment, monitoring, and incident response, requirement analysis, and policies. We have other teams within the CISO umbrella that take care of those. But most of the work that we do that is engineer facing on my product security team is design and implementation review and pen testing. So pen testing is actually something that is new to me. When I joined this role, I was thoroughly a defensive security researcher. So most of my work life, which has been almost 7 years now, I had been doing defensive security, which is threat modeling, trying to come up with scenarios where something could go wrong and coming up with controls to make sure that we mitigate the risk. But recently, I was also given an opportunity to practice my offensive security skills. So I have been trying to learn, and I have been working on penetration testing, also ethical hacking in the last couple of months. So I have started learning how to use Burp Suite and other tools to be able to hack our own applications at work, and also how to do it ethically, which is actually pretty interesting because you have to think about what you're trying to exploit, and if you're working with particularly sensitive information, how to ensure that you come up with a proof of concept which doesn't necessarily reveal everything. Hopefully this slide is not really a redo of everything Prima went over, but my take on how to get started in security is mostly if you have a lot of curiosity and motivation and you're willing to do a lot of learning, then that is a pretty great platform. There are a few ways to actually go and get security certifications, like Prima said, or you can go back to school if you're early enough in your career. But if you're already a few years in and you have established a way that works for you to learn something new, certifications are a great way to go get an additional skill set that people can validate that you had. Or you can do online courses, you can attend conferences, and if you really have a lot of motivation and dedication, you can also self-learn a lot of things, such as ethical hacking. You can learn by going to the OWASP Bricks web app or the Damn Vulnerable web application. If you're interested in threat modeling, you can look at a few of the books that are out there. I think there's a threat modeling book that Adam Shostak wrote sometime in 2012, maybe, or 2010. That's really good. That's a really great resource to get started on. Yeah, just be part of communities, attend conferences. Someone mentioned the Women in Cybersecurity conference. I think it was Shreya. I was there too, actually, last week. It was a great atmosphere, just talking to different people, figuring out what they're working on, if you're interested, and exchanging ideas and resources on how to learn things that you find interesting. I love security. I've had the opportunity to, either by virtue of different roles or like opportunities where we couldn't hire someone for 9 months, so then I had to do that job and learn new skill sets, to wear a lot of different hats, which is why it's the picture on the right, lots of different hats in the field that you can wear. You can do offensive versus defensive security depending on what you're interested in. You can do proactive, which is before something is deployed, before the world gets to see it, how do you ensure that you have all the security controls in the application before it goes out, versus reactive security, whereas you work on the incident response team. So there are externally reported vulnerabilities that filter through your team. You verify the proof of concept that comes in and then work with engineers to patch it. And then, of course, there's also the purely technical hands-on work versus like technical plus policy kind of work. Like, what is it that we're trying to make sure? How do we need to protect it? How do we figure out what the risks are? Like, what does risk look like for our organization? Within that, what does information security risk look like? All of these are like interesting facets or different parts in the security field that draw different kinds of people. So you can always find something they're interested in, and there will be some related security field that is adjacent to that or part of that that you can explore. It's an evolving field. The fundamentals definitely remain constant, but since the technologies change so fast, since our use cases keep developing, it's fun to learn new skill sets to remain up to date. That was mostly my talk. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. And you can also reach out to me on my email or just find me on LinkedIn.
Great. Thank you so much, Devika. I have a question. So going from Adobe, it's a software company based on creative software, creative tools. Do you find it's very different going into Bloomberg? And what are some of the, let's say, certification that maybe Bloomberg require you to continuously have compared to Adobe?
That's a great question. They're actually, even though the fields are so different, Adobe is, a technical media organization that works in creative solutions. Bloomberg is a financial tech organization that it works with its clients that are people on Wall Street. The engineering teams very much are very similar in that I have neither a creative artsy background nor do I know very much about finance. So it was actually pretty much the same working with engineers in both places. I think the difference was very much in how the security teams were structured and what the culture was like, and where in my career I was when I was in both of these places. So at Adobe, I was very much a junior person. I was right out of school. I really benefited from an extended security in the software development lifecycle structure already in place. So I was able to absorb how different teams interacting with each other within the security space for creating a secure roadmap for a product to be deployed securely worked. So there was already an established, like, okay, if you come up with a new feature, you would have to go through threat modeling if it impacts security, and then what the result of that threat model would be, and a timeline within which to fix the vulnerabilities that rise out of it, and then deploy it after sign off by the team here. So, but when I joined Bloomberg, all of these were happening because the team in Bloomberg was younger than the team in Adobe. Adobe had a security team for a large security team for a while, and while Bloomberg did have its risk team, the number of people scaled up, I think, only a couple of years before I joined. So while the knowledge was there, there was not yet at the scale that it was there at Adobe. So I was excited to help build it out. So by the time I joined, I brought over a lot of my skill sets of being able to evangelize security within engineers, help build out a pipeline to move from coming with a new product, what should the next step would be, how do we figure out what happens when we have issues that we find during threat modeling or design review, what timelines look like. So all of these were coming up as I was joining. So I was happy to help build out this pipeline at Bloomberg. But yeah, in essence, it didn't feel like I was shifting roles. It felt like I was growing in my role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's good to know that you didn't have to learn a new process. You were able to carry on what you already know and also grow more into your Bloomberg role. That sounds great.
Definitely. And I've had a lot of opportunities here that I didn't have before. Now that I had some baseline, I was able to use a lot of encouragement from my management and from the engineering side to build out security awareness and trainings and things like that, which help scale. Because at most organizations, the number of engineers will always outnumber the security teams. So it's important to have people on the engineering side also who are just as involved in making sure that security is part of the process and not just something that comes in at the end before deployment.
Okay, thank you for sharing that insight. Great. Do you recommend any conferences besides the one that Prima mentioned earlier? Do you have any preferred?
Right, a lot of those are also on my list. I really enjoyed the Women in Cybersecurity conference that happened last week that Shreya mentioned. I used to go regularly to Black Hat up until 2015 or 16. I don't think I've been in the last couple of years. I also go to Grace Hopper, and I also presented at Grace Hopper last year, and that was super fun. There's a great community of women in security who attend these conferences. Always great catching up and talking with them. Then there is B-Sides that I attend in New York, as well as when I was living in San Francisco, I would try to go to B-Sides over there. And a lot of the local meetups, I would suggest attending the OS meetups too. Then there's also AppSec California. If you're interested, you could go to that. Then there's Usenix, a little more of like the theory side coming up. Usenix typically goes over like a lot of research that was done in the previous year that is like both industry as well as like theory, but it's worth going to. And if you're in the Bay Area, I would even say look at the universities. Like there's a lot of talks and events that happen at Berkeley and Stanford. Also, even if you're not in the city itself, that are fun to go to.
Okay, I didn't know about that. That's a great little tip to check out school conferences or school chapters. Sometimes, I think different organization will go to school and try to help students to have a head start to get into the real world, right? Kind of like, seamlessly linking.
You're so right, because when I was doing my master's in information security, there weren't as many schools that had it as a separate track or like a degree. But now you have a lot of schools that have that. So they almost always, in a lot of schools, they have people coming in and talking about what it is like in the industry. So if you're close to a school, you should totally go check it out.
Great, thank you.
And I will plug my my organization too. We are definitely hiring at Bloomberg too. If you're interested, please reach out to me. And of course, mine is just one out of many security facing roles that you could be interested in. So I am happy to talk more, even if what I do is not exactly what you would like to do. Happy to brainstorm.
Great, thank you for offering that. And then Bloomberg, are they all over the country?
That's a great question. We have engineering teams in London, San Francisco, and in New York, but the security team itself is based mostly out of New York.
Oh, great. Thanks for the clarification.
Perfect. Thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks, Jane, for the opportunity to speak.